It's time for a Delphi Murders trial update. We're already through one full week of testimony and well into week two. Some extraordinary new details have come to light during the first 10 days, showing just how police came to suspect Richard Allen as the man who murdered 14-year-old Libby German and her best friend, 13-year-old Abby Williams, back in February 2017. My name is Drew Tripp for Criminally Obsessed, and there's so much new information that for this update, I'm going to start at the top and tell this story in chronological order right up to the point of Richard Allen's arrest 2 years ago. That will allow me to include the new details from trial in context and help anyone who hasn't followed the case extensively catch up on the backstory. Now, before we dive in, I want to shout out the amazing local journalists in the state of Indiana who are covering every second of this trial. Cameras aren't allowed in the courtroom for this case, so we're all relying on their old-fashioned written updates that they're churning out anytime there's a break in the trial. That's a tough job. I've been there, I've done that. It is no fun sometimes, but they're doing great work, and that's how this recap is even possible. So a big shout out to them. Thank you so much for the hard work you're doing. Libby German and Abby Williams were dropped off at the Monon High Bridge Trail in Delphi, Indiana, shortly after 1:30 p.m. on February 13th, 2017. It was an unseasonably warm day and the last day of winter break from school for the girls. Libby called her dad and arranged for him to pick her and Abby up when they were done. The last thing Libby German said to her grandmother before she got out of the car was, "Grandma, I'll be okay." At 2:07 p.m., Libby took a photo of Abby crossing the Monon High Bridge. That photo was definitive proof of the girls' last known location that day. Loved ones say they lost contact with the girls sometime shortly thereafter. By 3:30 that afternoon, Libby's dad was sounding the alarm. By 5 p.m., searches had begun. Later that night, a police officer walking the trail looking for the girls said he noticed the ground was disturbed off the side of the trail just past the end of the bridge. The officer looked for more sign in the area, but didn't find anything that night. The next day, a member of the search party found Libby's shirt and shoes in the creek about a quarter of a mile from the bridge. Another searcher heard about the discovery and came to help look in the area of the creek. The man saw something that looked out of place across the creek on some private property up the hill opposite of where the trail was and where the girls were last seen. The man walked up the hill, and that's where he found the girls' bodies. When police arrived, they found the girls covered in sticks, apparently to hide their bodies. Libby was completely nude, while Abby was wearing some of Libby's clothes. The clothes that Abby wore were still damp, apparently from where the girls had crossed the creek the day before. There was blood all over the ground. Both girls' throats had been slashed. Libby's injuries were especially sinister. Her throat was cut at least 4 times, and possibly 5, according to medical examiners. Meanwhile, Abby's neck was only cut once. There was a slight blemish on her chin that might have been from duct tape, but the mark was not prominent enough to determine what it was. Medical examiners looked for evidence of sexual violence, but couldn't find any obvious sign of trauma or DNA evidence to suggest that sort of abuse had occurred. They didn't rule it out, but said there was no clear evidence of such an assault. DNA analysis from the girls' clothes and bodies and crime scene showed minimal amounts of male DNA was present, but likely just from ordinary transfer in their daily lives, and not even enough to effectively test. Bloodstain analysis suggested Libby's body was moved after she died. Crime scene investigators believe she died sitting upright and was possibly dragged by one arm into the spot where she was ultimately found. Blood on Libby's hands and feet suggests she might have also been up and moving around after she was first attacked. Abby, meanwhile, most likely died where she lay. There was no evidence that her body was moved or disturbed after she suffered her fatal wound. Crime scene investigators noted Abby did not have any of her own blood on her hands, unlike Libby. That suggests that Abby might have been restrained or possibly unconscious when she was killed. That calls back to the blemish found on Abby's face that one analyst thought might have been from duct tape. Experts believe it would have taken no more than 10 minutes for the girls to die after suffering their wounds, and they probably passed out from blood loss beforehand. Investigators aren't sure if the girls were killed at the exact same time or perhaps a few minutes apart. Based on the evidence at the crime scene, investigators said on the witness stand they were not able to rule out the possibility of more than one attacker or that the girls might have been killed with more than one weapon. As investigators combed through the crime scene, an unfired .40 caliber pistol round was found on the ground near the girls' bodies. Libby's cell phone was found underneath her body. A data analysis showed the phone locked for the final time at 2:14 p.m. the prior day, and health app data showed it stopped moving a few minutes later at 2:32 p.m. Further analysis of the phone revealed an incredible piece of evidence. Right before the phone locked for the final time, Libby recorded a video that police believed captured the girl's killer. That video, which is just over 40 seconds long, shows a man in a blue jacket walking toward the girls across the bridge in the background. Abby and Libby are talking to each other, and one of the girls sounds like she says, "Is he right there? Don't leave me up here." A few seconds pass, then the girls go back and forth. One says, "See, this is the path." The other responds, there's no path there, so we have to go down there." Some who've listened to the recording believe one of the girls also says something about a gun, but it's apparently hard to make out. What's not hard to make out in that video is the sudden interruption from a man's voice. You've probably heard this before. Shortly after that, the recording stops. Several witnesses walking on the Monon High Bridge Trail that day have testified about seeing the man in the blue jacket. He stood out to them because he didn't speak to anyone, and because of the blue jacket itself. As we mentioned at the beginning, it was really nice outside that day. Nobody would have needed a big heavy coat like he was wearing. One of the witnesses, Sarah Carbaugh, said she saw that man in the blue jacket later that afternoon as she was driving down a country road not far from the trails. She said he was covered in mud and blood and acting really sketchy. It freaked her out, and she didn't even report it to police for a few weeks after the fact because she said she was scared. Richard Allen's defense lawyers have tried to seize on that fact and also have pointed out what they say are some pretty significant inconsistencies with her story, but Carbaugh was not backing down on the witness stand when they tried to confront her. But ultimately, none of that evidence or witness testimony led to Richard Allen in the infant stage of the investigation. Now, we learn Allen was questioned by law enforcement about 5 days after the murders. A state natural resources officer assisting in the investigation interviewed Allen, and he admitted during that interview to being on the trail around the same time as the girls, but he said he never saw them. The game warden who interviewed Allen testified nothing about their conversation in 2017 stands out to him even all these years later, and he filed his notes from the interview with the lead investigators at the time and just moved on. As evidence of what's now described as a chaotic, disorganized early part of the investigation by law enforcement, someone marked Allen as cleared as a suspect soon after that interview with the game warden. That led to police basically forgetting all about him for the next 5 years. Allen came back on investigators' radars in September 2022 when Kathy Shank, a retired Child Protective Services agent volunteering on the case, came across a record with Allen's name on it while clerking some files. Shank handed the file over to detectives, saying it might be worth another look since Allen had admitted to being on the trail the same day as the girls when they were murdered. After reviewing the file, the county sheriff and the former police chief in Delphi called Allen in for questioning in mid-October 2022. They testified that Allen's story started off basically the same, but the two lawmen say red flags went up for them because of some new details that were added to his story and some that changed. Allen's story was that he came home from visiting his mom, grabbed a blue or maybe a black jacket from his house, and then went to the trails around noon on the day of the murders and was gone by 2 p.m. That jacket tidbit was compelling, but the timeline is what really grabbed detectives' attention. It was a full hour and a half earlier than the time frame he'd given in his 2017 interview. Little did Allen know when he said that, police had already taken note of the vehicles registered in his name and cross-referenced them with surveillance video from the area on the day of the murders. A black Ford Focus belonging to Allen was shown driving toward the trail parking area at 1:30, which was the time he originally said, and it was also about the exact same time that the girls arrived at the trail. During that interview with the sheriff and the police chief, Allen would go on to say that he did see some girls on the trail that day, but it was 3, not 2, and they were on a different bridge called the Freedom Bridge, not the Monon High Bridge. Allen said, in fact, he didn't see anyone else when he was on the High Bridge. The changes in Allen's story heightened police's suspicion, so they got a search warrant for his home. Inside, they found numerous knives, a bunch of box cutters, and a .40 caliber pistol. They also found a blue Carhartt jacket that looked an awful lot like the one worn by the man on the bridge in Libby's video. That's not all. Police also seized 23 electronic devices from Allen's home, including several of his old cell phones. Interestingly, though, the one phone Allen didn't have anymore was the one he was using in 2017. Police would test all those electronics they seized for digital evidence linking Allen to the murders, but again, they didn't find anything. The most they found was that Allen had done internet searches for details about the murders, which is hardly suspicious in a small town like Delphi after such a horrific crime. Police also DNA tested clothes and other items they collected as evidence from Allen's home, but there were no matches to Libby or Abby. However, the one piece of evidence that did come back as a match was that .40 caliber pistol round found at the crime scene. Every gun imprints unique markings on the soft brass and lead of the ammunition that it uses. These are called tool markings, and they're the most reliable things forensic scientists have come up with to positively match ammunition to the firearms they're used in. Now, here's where a bit of controversy comes in. Analysts for the prosecution said tool marks on the bullet from the crime scene are a very strong positive match to markings on casings from ammo fired through Allen's gun. Did you catch that? They said it was a strong match for markings on rounds that were fired from Allen's gun during testing. But the cartridge at the crime scene wasn't fired. It was only loaded into Allen's gun, then ejected, according to the prosecution's theory. In fact, when state police tried to reproduce the markings on other unfired ammo to match the tool markings by cycling them through Allen's gun, the results were inconclusive. It was only on fired, spent shell casings that the markings appeared to line up. Allen's defense lawyers have seized on this distinction. They're calling the testing and results an apples to oranges comparison and say the tool markings on the bullet from the scene proves absolutely nothing. They go on to call into question the efficacy of tool mark analysis as reliable science. But the bullet testing results were apparently enough for investigators to find probable cause for continuing their investigation into Richard Allen. Allen was brought back in for questioning on October 26, 2022. He was arrested that day and has been in jail ever since. A detective questioned Allen about the bullet during that interrogation. Allen claimed he didn't take his gun with him on the trails that day and had no idea how the bullet got there. The detective also asked Allen about the video of the man in the blue jacket on the bridge found on Libby German's phone. Allen insisted it was not him in the video, and he denied at least 20 times during that interview that he was the killer. But the detective conducting that interview with Allen said he noted, quote, very subtle signs of deception, and ended up arresting Allen on the spot. And that's the story so far. There's so much more to unpack in this trial we haven't gotten to yet. We can't wait to see what comes next in this trial over the next few days. Thanks for watching. Thanks for following along with us. Stay tuned.